Good morning. My name is Craig Brown, the adult ministries pastor here. And if you know me, you know that I like banana pudding. I really, really love banana pudding. And I'm not sure how far that goes back, but I do remember it being in the third grade and absolutely loving banana pudding and going to the lunchroom one day, and they were fixing the plates, cafeteria ladies were doing that, and I saw what I thought was banana pudding. Looked really, really good. And so I'm thinking, okay, who can I trade my banana pudding with? And it looked amazing. So I think that day we had fish sticks and fries, and I started trading, man, my roll, my fish sticks, my fries, and I began to have this big, big mound of banana pudding. Something should have made me realize that we would never get two desserts, and I had some Jell-O that I traded for more banana pudding, and it looked great. It was a beautiful color yellow, and it had what I thought was sliced bananas in it, and on top, I thought it was crumbled up vanilla wafer cookies, okay? And it looked really, really good. And so I had just a plate full, had no other food, had a big mound of what I thought was banana pudding, and I took a big old spoonful. I was excited. Remember, third grade. And I just took a big old bite, and as soon as it hits my taste buds, I realized it was not banana pudding, okay? And it was like a squash casserole, yellow squash casserole, and I just instantly spit it out all over the plate in that mound of squash casserole, and it was disgusting, okay? Very, very disgusting. Now, maybe this other scenario, maybe it's happened in your life. As a kid, I would go to the refrigerator and, make myself some toast, and I'm going to get the Country Crock butter-ish spread to put on my toast. And I go in there, and I have to go through 5 Country Crock containers before I find the butterish spread. And in one of them, I open it up, and it's like, is this meat or is this cake? I'm not really sure at all. Pretty disgusting. But whether it's the smell of green peas or broccoli casserole or, milk past its expiration date or whatever, we all have foods that just kind of elicit this feeling of disgust. It makes us disgusted, but we're not born with it because, as a babies will put anything in their mouth, right? But somehow as we get older, maybe past the toddler stage, certain foods begin to make us feel a little bit disgusted. And it's called the psychology of disgust. And whether it's, gas station sushi or spoiled milk, we have something inside of us. Our brains are wired to be disgusted when we see it or smell it, or if there's something else that reminds us of that food, and we create these mental boundaries. These mental boundaries, and so once we may have tried it or we've heard about this is not good, don't eat it, we've got these boundaries set up, and so we avoid these types of foods. We avoid them. Now, let me help you illustrate this a little bit more. All right? All right, I want you to just kind of work up some saliva in your mouth, okay? Just work it up and swallow. Easy, no problem, right? Now, what if I did this? Would anybody spit in their own cup and drink it back really quick? No, that's disgusting, right? But there's no difference between the saliva that we just swallowed and if we spit it in a cup and drink it a couple of seconds later. But somehow in our minds, we've created this mental boundary that once saliva that's in our mouth, it's good. If we don't have it, our mouths are dry. In fact, my mouth is dry now. I want some of that water. If I can work up some more saliva in my mouth, we couldn't eat crackers without it. But once it comes out of our mouth, it's no longer saliva. It's disgusting, dirty, contaminated, nasty spit, right? So the way we're wired is anything that disgusts us, we resist it or we repel it, okay? And if you eat something that maybe was bad for you, you may spit it out, just like I did the stewed squash or squash casserole. You may spit it out. You may not even want to go near it. And that's okay. It's great when it comes to food. But it's not okay. It's not okay when we project this feeling of disgust towards people. It's not okay at all. Sometimes we have, and you may think in your mind, maybe there's a person who you just avoid because they disgust you. Maybe it's a type of person. Maybe it's a group of people. And maybe you're sickened by this person or this group of people. And maybe you would not even touch them. It's sad, but there are people in Texarkana that feel that way towards other people. Maybe even somebody in this room feels that way towards other people. And it was true of the Pharisees in Jesus' time as well. So I want to look at Matthew chapter 9, and we want to look at this idea of projecting disgust towards individuals or even specific groups of people. And we want to look at how Jesus responded to this situation. So we'll look at Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 9. And it says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he got up and followed him. And then it happened, as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were dining with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why is your teacher eating with the tax collectors and the sinners? But when Jesus heard this, he said, it's not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. Then he goes on. He says, but go and learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So look at verse 9 again. We're going to kind of dive into these verses. It says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting in his tax collector's booth. Now, Jesus had just healed a paralyzed man, and the Pharisees were giving him a hard time. Not only did he heal this guy, he actually forgave him of his sins. And so they were losing their mind over that. And so he's traveling along with his group of guys that he was with, and he sees Matthew. Now, sometimes we think of Matthew, and we just think, hey, great Matthew. He's one of the 12 disciples, wrote the Gospel of Matthew, good old Matthew. But we never really see him many times as somebody who was an outcast, who was despicable, he was actually just like Zacchaeus. He was a despised tax collector. And the Jews in that area hated tax collectors because they colluded with Rome to collect tax, and they actually added on their percentage on top of it, and sometimes they would add an enormous percentage. And these guys were usually very, very wealthy, and they were hated by the people around them. Now, I imagine seeing Matthew as Jesus comes up to Matthew, and he probably had a group of guys, his armed thugs around him to protect him, because many people would have wanted him hurt or even dead. And so, as Jesus comes up to Matthew, it wasn't a case of mistaken identity where Jesus goes, hey, man, I didn't realize you were a tax collector. Sorry, my bad, and move on. No, Jesus specifically went to Matthew, a hated and despised tax collector. And he goes up to him, and he asked him to be his disciple. No Jewish rabbi would have ever asked a tax collector to be their disciple. They hated him. They didn't even want to be around him. They were disgusted by tax collectors and other sinners as well. So there's no way that would have happened. You can imagine what's going on through Matthew's mind. I've heard of Jesus. Man, he's done miracles, and now he's asking me to be his follower? What is going on? So he followed him. And in fact, he actually invited him to dinner. Now, I can imagine this is what's going on with Matthew. He goes and tells his friends, his other tax collector friends, and it says in some translations, other disreputable sinners. So he hung out with a group of people that the Pharisees would have never been around, detested, avoided, wouldn't touch or be around at all. So he's telling these guys, hey guys, you're never going to believe what happened. I was sitting at the booth today, and Jesus came by. Y'all know who Jesus is, right? And his friends would say, duh, yeah. I mean, he's like, everybody knows who he is. Man, he's like, must be a superhero. He's got these superpowers. He does miracles. Yeah, we know who he is. Get with the story, Matthew. Well, you're not going to believe this. Dude, I am serious. This is so true. He came by, and he's coming to dinner tonight, and I want y'all to come too. And they're like, no way, dude. There is no way in Sheol that Jesus is coming to your house for dinner, okay? It's not going to happen. It's not possible. You're dreaming. You must have ate some bad food or something. It's not happening. He says, no, guys, I'm serious. Come to my house, you're going to see. And he says, that's not even the best part. Here's the best part. He actually asked me to be one of his disciples. And I can imagine his friends thinking, okay, no way. Jesus didn't come up to you and talk to you. He's a famous rabbi, and he wants you to be his disciple. They don't even talk to us, okay? The Pharisees, the religious crowd, that's not going to happen. But you know what? We're going to call you on this, and we're going to show up at your house tonight. For one, we know you throw a good party. You've got great food, great wine. So we're going to be there, and Jesus is not going to be there. So I think in verse 10 it says this. It says, then it happened that Jesus, as Jesus was reclining at the table in the house, so he is there. Can you imagine these guys thinking, Jesus really is here? He's really in the house. Matthew was not kidding. He's actually here. He showed up. And you know what? They realized they really liked Jesus. But they were nothing like him. They had almost zero in common. But somehow they liked Jesus. He actually made them feel like part of his family. There was no condemnation. There was no judgmental attitude. There was no hellfire and brimstone. They actually felt like they were human beings, and he loved on them. And they reclined at the table. They were probably laughing, having a good time, telling stories. And then the Pharisees heard about it. Maybe they heard the rumors or the gossip. And they decided, let's go over close by Matthew's house. We're not going in that house. There's no possible way, because they're tax collectors and sinners. So they passed by. Yeah, Jesus has done some things that maybe they're questionable, but there's no way he would actually be there. This has got to be a rumor. This has got to be gossip. So they show up, and they're outside, and there wasn't, glass windows. I'm sure they had shutters that were opened up. They probably had lamps on the inside. So the inside of the house is illuminated. As they're outside, they can see Jesus actually sitting and reclining at the table with Matthew and the rest of his tax collector friends. Matthew and all of his friends in low places, okay? They're all there. And then they somehow get the attention of some of Jesus' disciples. And I think it's the very next verse. They saw this and they said, why is your teacher eating with the tax collectors and the sinners? One translation says, why is your teacher eating with such scum? This was like the worst people they could imagine. They didn't want to touch them. They didn't want to be around them. They avoided them at all costs. So why is he even doing this? I thought he's like, a rabbi, a teacher. There's no way we would do that. We're disgusted by these people. And then Jesus answers. So when he heard this, he said, it's not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I can imagine it. They're in the house eating. The other guys and the disciples are on the outside. And Jesus is like, hey, guys, we can hear you. We can hear you talking. He says, it's not those who are healthy who need the physician. It's people who are sick. They need the physician. Then he slams them. He cuts them down. He puts them in their place, but in the nicest way possible. Look at what he says. When in verse 13, he says, but go and learn what this means. He's basically saying, okay, guys, you guys know a lot about, the scriptures, the Torah. You probably have it memorized, but you really don't know jack about my Father or what he desires. So he's like, hey, guys, why don't y'all go and study the scriptures again and see if you can understand the meaning or the difference between compassion and sacrifice, mercy and sacrifice. He was actually quoting an Old Testament verse in the book of Hosea where God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He says, I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. In some translations it says, I didn't come to call the self-righteous, the people who think they're righteous, but I came to call those who know that they're sinners and they need me. So these Pharisees, they had somehow had this disgust towards people who didn't follow the rules the way they did. And so they were disgusted by them. They thought, we're just totally disgusted with these despicable tax collectors, these disreputable sinners, these horrible people. We don't want to have anything at all to do with them. Nothing. And so when Jesus asked them this question, you need to go and learn the meaning between mercy and sacrifice. Man, when we begin to understand the difference between mercy and sacrifice, it's going to help us to love people better. It's going to help us to love people better. Look at this quote here. This is by William Miller. He wrote a book called The Anatomy of Disgust. And he says humans are most likely the only species that experiences disgust, and the only one capable of loathing its own species. So Jesus says, hey, you need to learn the difference between mercy and sacrifice. And when we do that, when we understand the difference, it's going to help us to love people better. It's going to help us to love people better. So what is the difference between mercy and sacrifice? Well, let's look at sacrifice. Sacrifice is intentionally pursuing towards purity. And see, that's what the Pharisees were doing. They somehow thought that they had to follow the law. They had to be ceremonially clean or ceremonially pure. They had to do all these rules and all these regulations to make God accept them, to make God like them, to make God approve of them. And so that's what they tried to do. They sacrificed. They sacrificed time. They sacrificed money. They sacrificed bulls and goats and sheep. They even sacrificed people. Now, they didn't sacrifice people physically on an altar and kill them, but what they did is they sacrificed relationships with people that God created because this is what they thought. If they hang around people who are not like us, some of that's going to rub off on us. If we hang around people who are doing things that we disapprove of, somehow it's going to taint our purity and our holiness. But let me let you in on something. If you're a believer, if you're a Christ follower, you are already approved, you are already pure, you're already holy. You didn't do it yourself. God has done it in us. He's the one who does it. You are complete in Christ. And you never have to worry about trying to follow a set of rules or regulations to make God approve of you or like you or love you, because he already does. And nothing can ever make you unclean or impure ever again. And so the idea of being around somebody who believes differently, who acts differently, looks differently, a different walk of life, economic, whatever, that somehow they could make us impure or unclean is totally ridiculous. It doesn't make sense at all. If we've been made holy and God has done it, nothing can change that. So that's what the Pharisees were trying to do. So mercy is a little bit different. Mercy is embracing and intentionally moving toward people who are different. See, Jesus went after people and went and built relationships with people who the religious crowd would have never went after, who they considered unclean, impure, unholy. Jesus went after them and built a relationship with them. And when we do that and we love people in that kind of way, it makes them curious about Christ. It makes them curious about Christ. About 10 years ago, in 2008, I read a book called The Fine Line, Re-envisioning the Gap Between Culture and Christ. Because here's the deal. The church has a set of ideas, what they believe is right and wrong, true or false. Culture has a set of ideas that they believe is right and true. But then when there's this gap, when they're different, there's a gap that emerges. And the larger that gap, the more disgust there is for the other side. And so in this book, The Fine Line, the author Carrie Oberbrunner writes this. He says, when we're dealing with culture as believers, we can respond in one of three ways. One of three ways. We can either be separatists and we can separate from culture. We can get all the way on the opposite side of culture and we can say we don't want to have anything to do with culture. We don't want to have anything to do with people who are different than us, who believe different, look different, act different. And we're going to seclude ourselves in this Christian bubble, this Christian subculture. And we're going to have Christian clothing, Christian music, Christian food, Christian everything. It's our own little group, and we're going to be secluded. And we're going to have nothing to do with them. People in this area, they have zero influence on the world around them. Zero influence on culture. So it says you can be a separatist or you can be on the opposite side. You can be on the total opposite extreme, and he calls this side conformist. And you can look exactly like the world around you. You can act, you can react, you can live, you can look just like the world around you, and there's absolutely zero difference with the world around you. You're basically just, both sides are just walking in their own strength, their own flesh, and not in God's Spirit. One looks negative, one looks positive, but they're both in the flesh. And he said we can be on this side, and people in this area who conform just like culture, they have zero influence on culture. He says, or there's a third and better option. He said we can be something called transformist. We can be people who are in the world but not of the world. People who don't seclude themselves from the world, and people who don't blend in and look exactly like it as well. We're here, we're living in the world, we're living around people who are totally different than us. But we love them in a way, that makes them curious about Christ. We're engaging culture instead of running away or blending in. And we're loving people where they're at. In fact, we're intentionally moving towards relationships with people who may be totally different than us. They may not be believers. They may look totally different than us. They may act totally different than us. But we're moving towards those relationships intentionally, on purpose. So, how can you be a transformist? How can you do that? I used all my saliva a while ago, so need some more. So I'm going to give you a practical way that you can be a transformist. And let me ask you this. Do we really want to transform Texarkana? Do we really want to transform Texarkana? I think we do. I think we do. And here's one way you can. You can make your circle bigger. Now, what do you mean by that, Craig? What are you talking about? Well, let me show you. Let me give you the opposite of making your circle bigger. When you make your circle small, your reach will get smaller and smaller. And what I mean by that is when we begin to make our circle around us, the people that are like us, that's what our circle is. Everybody has what they call, psychologists call a moral circle, okay? And we include people in that circle who believe like us, act like us, look like us, okay? And we include them in our circle. They may not even be our friends. We may not even know them, okay? Now, we should have a group of people that we're doing life together in a community group. We grow in our faith together. Man, we all need that, and that needs to be a small, tight group. But what I'm talking about is the way we treat people that are around us. We can treat people that are in our circle like family. Well, let me give you an illustration. Let's say you have a nephew, and your nephew starts a job at a restaurant, one of your favorite restaurants, and you decide the whole family's going out. It's his first night working. We're all going to go, and we're going to sit in his area. We're going to let him wait on us, and, man, we're just going to be a great time. So your nephew's working, and he brings you fish instead of the steak that you ordered. And you're thinking, that's okay. I really like blackened catfish. It's good. That's all good. That's fine. And then, you drink your glass of tea, and he never comes back and refills your glass. And you're thinking, I really wasn't that thirsty. One glass is enough. That's just too much caffeine. I'm okay with that. And at the end of the night, he brings you your check. You had a totally different food that you ordered. You're still thirsty. But you know what? You give him a huge tip, okay? I mean, a big tip. You tip him well, maybe even almost as much as the bill itself. But let's say the very next weekend, you go to another restaurant, and there's somebody else's nephew that's working, and it's his first night as well, too. And he comes to your table, takes your order, comes back, and he brings you Coke Zero instead of Diet Coke. You're like, are you kidding me? There's a huge difference between Coke Zero and Diet Coke, right? Not really, but. And then he brings you your steak, and it is medium instead of medium rare. And you're thinking, this is pink and not pinkish red. How in the world am I going to eat this? This is disgusting. And so in your mind, the tip is going down, down, and down. And he can tell that you're visibly upset. And so he says, hey, sir, man, I'm sorry this is not working out tonight exactly how you wanted it. It's my first night. And so he even offers you a complimentary dessert. And still, at the end of the night, You give him like 1% tip. I mean, it's like an embarrassing, lowest possible tip ever, other than not giving him anything at all. So what is the difference between your nephew and somebody else's nephew? The difference is he's not in your family, right? He's not family. He's not in your circle. He's just a guy who works at a restaurant. Because we have this small circle. But what if we made our circle larger? Here's the deal. When you make your circle large, your reach gets larger and larger. What if every person in this room decided to enlarge their circle? What if we said, you know what, it doesn't matter where I go, who I meet, whoever God puts in my path, I'm going to treat them just like family. What would happen if we did that? I'll tell you what would happen. We'd transform Texarkana. And here's the deal. You can do that. I can do that because we have the Spirit of God living inside of us. If you're a believer, the very same power that raised Christ from the dead lives inside of you. And He's given us everything to live a godly life. And He wants His love to pour out through us onto every person that we come in contact with. So what if we enlarge that circle and we treated everybody in that circle like family? Not dysfunctional George Costanza's family, okay? But I mean like the Waltons family, you know, like this family that loves everybody. They may not agree, they may have differences, but they love each other at the end of the day, no matter what. What if it didn't matter who was in your family and who was in your circle? What if you didn't care what they looked like? What if you didn't care how they acted? What if you said, you know what, it doesn't matter what race they are. It doesn't matter if they're tall, if they're short, if they're fat, they're skinny. It doesn't matter at all. I'm going to love every person that comes in my contact. I'm including them in my circle, and I'm going to love them like family, even if I don't agree with them. And you know what? As I love them like family, it may cause them to be curious about Christ. Because they may think, I can't imagine this person loving me because we are opposite, we're totally different. They don't agree with me, I don't agree with them. What would happen? We'd transform Texarkana, right? What if you didn't care what political party they were a part of or sports team they were a part of? What if you didn't care about any of those things? You said, I'm going to love people that God puts in my path. I'm going to love them like family. So do you really want to transform Texarkana? Our ability to influence the culture around us is directly related to our disgust. So if we're disgusted about our community and our culture, we're never going to have influence and we're never going to reach them. But here's what I've learned. When you have family, they may do things just like people on the outside do, but you're never disgusted. You may be disappointed, but you're not disgusted with your family because they're your family, right? And you love them unconditionally. What if we included everybody in Texarkana? If every person in this room enlarged their circle and we begin to love people like Christ loves us inside that circle, it would transform Texarkana. Let's pray. God, I thank you for each person in this room. They've been created by you. They're loved by you. And those who are us in this room that are believers, you've given us your Spirit inside of us. We are in your circle. You are in us. And you want to use us to transform Texarkana. You want to use us to make an impact in this culture, to engage it, not run away and not blend in, but to walk in this culture and to meet people where they're at and share the love of Christ with them in such a way that makes them curious about Christ. God, we want you to love through us. And we want to see this complete culture. We want to see Texarkana transformed by the love of Christ. Thank you for loving us and using us to be your hands and feet to transform this community. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.